Welcome to the Backlot 605 podcast. I am your host for this show. I am Casey Kelderman, and today we are going to be joined on another interview. This one I am very excited about because, as you all know, if you listened to the show before, I am the big horror fan on Backlot 605, and that is why I'm so excited to introduce David Weiner. He is the director of the In Search of Darkness documentary. David, how are you?
I'm good. Happy to be here, and thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on and discussing the documentary with us. So let's start with a little bit about the documentary. Now, this is, I like to, because some of the other people were asking about this, because I heard about it for the longest time, and you know, I knew about the Indiegogo page for it. But for people who are listening and don't know what the In Search of Darkness documentary is, could you let them know a little bit about what the documentary is?
Yeah, sure. It's a journey into 80s horror movies. It's a 4+ hour film that has close to 50 people who are part of this movement back in the 80s. So you've got directors, writers, actors, composers, special effects masters. Plus entertainment journalists, horror journalists, YouTube creators, all telling the tale of a huge decade of amazing filmmaking.
Now, the question I have to ask is, have you always been a horror fan then?
Oh yeah, I've been a horror fan ever since I was a kid. I was a monster kid growing up, watching, the Universal monsters, Dracula, Frankenstein, Wolfman, Creature from the Black Lagoon was always my favorite out of all Godzilla movies. And as I got, I was a reader of Famous Monsters, and then I ended up being the executive editor of Famous Monsters. So that probably might tell you something about the type of person that I am. But I'm a big pop culture enthusiast, and I really consume this stuff. And once the slasher genre and the supernatural genre in the 70s really started to take hold and gave way to an amazing, diverse array of creative filmmaking in the 80s, I was on board pretty much starting with The Exorcist and the Amityville Horror and The Omen, and then Halloween really just rocked my world.
This is, like you said, it's over a 4-hour documentary. Where did you come up with this idea to take on such a big task? You know, the 80s, when you think of horror films, most of those that people think of in like pop culture and in the world right now, it's from the 80s. So the question I guess I have is, why decide to tackle such a big topic all in one documentary?
Well, and we there's so much to chew on. There's absolutely a huge amount of movies that came out in that decade, but it represents a real sort of change in the direction of the horror genre. Franchises really took hold. Practical effects really sort of changed the way people looked at these films and wanted to see them, because these amazing special effects kind of became the calling card for a lot of these films, alongside a lot of base and entertainment, base sex and nudity and gore and violence and humor and irreverence from a lot of indie directors. And so that's always been an appeal to many, and very nostalgic to many at this stage in time, looking back. Executive producer Robin Block, he came up with the idea that he wanted to really take a journey through this decade that really had not been focused on before. There have been many surveys of horror history, lots of documentaries that focus very specifically on one film, or franchise, like Crystal Lake Memories, or the Elm Street and the Elm Street and the Friday the 13th documentaries come to mind. But we really wanted to focus in on a decade that is really just solely, it hasn't been tackled before, and it's very hard to tackle because so much changed during that time. So we wanted to attempt it, and it takes 4 hours and 20 minutes to just scratch the surface, in my opinion.
Yeah, I had the chance to watch it, and I mean, you bring up the Nightmare on Elm Street and Friday the 13th documentaries, and I love those. And like,
Which is called Never Sleep Again. Sorry, I
yes,
didn't give the title of that. Go ahead.
yep, and I love those, and I loved this documentary as well because you tackle some of those films or franchises that really haven't been explored before in the documentary style. You know, you take on some of the like cult classics like Toxic Avenger or Chopping Mall, and you bring those to light. And I guess the question I have next is what is the film that you brought up during the documentary that you feel was underexplored in other forms of media, whether that be other documentaries or written articles?
Well, there's so many of the more eccentric ones that, I mean, it's like The Shining has its own documentary called Room 237 that just is a deep dive into the hardcore conspiracy theories. And then the other two that I mentioned, those are hours long, hours and hours as long. I think Crystal Lake Memories is 6 hours or so. Um, I think some of the, like, for example, Basket Case comes to mind. Frank Henenlotter's Basket Case. That's just an odd, entertaining, weird, disturbing, just balls out film. And I think that's sort of a perfect example of that. Um, but it's kind of an even playing field when you're looking at all these films. I would put, because they sit within the same decade and the same time frame, you could put these alongside the Poltergeist and The Shining, or Fright Night and The Lost Boys, and you could have these weird, funky, eclectic films like Society, Brian Usna's Society, or Henenlotter's Basket Case. And I think as horror fans approach these things, it's all just beloved favorites. The weirder, the better. If it's got body horror, if it's got freakish characters, it's all a lot of humanity at the base of all this, and I think people respond to that. So it was nice to be able to sort of single out those as well as the big ones.
Yeah, one thing that really makes the documentary stand out from others is that you bring in all these, these big names like John Carpenter and Tom Holland and like Doug Bradley and Heather Langenkamp, but they're not just talking about their own films, they're talking about other films from that genre. Is that one of the things that you tried to do while developing this idea for this documentary? Is not
Absolutely, very much so.
Yeah.
And I'm glad you picked up on that, because I think it's like hanging out with a nice conversation with these people, hanging out over coffee or drinks, talking about their favorite movies and what inspired them, and their take on why this decade was so fun and important and influential. And we've seen these actors and directors and these creators again and again and again talking about their own projects. But my goal was to ideally, in addition to having them talk about what we have heard before, potentially from a different angle or point of view, hopefully they reveal something, a nuance or a detail or a nugget that's something that you haven't heard before. But also, really, like they're humans who like to sit down at the end of the day and enjoy a good movie and be entertained or scared. And that's really what I was going for. And it's kind of funny too, because Heather Langenkamp, I've worked with her several times before, back in my Entertainment Tonight days and my Famous Monsters days. And so I asked her to come along on this, and I was very honored to have her agree to do it, because I know she's super busy. And it's funny, she walked into the interview and she said, "David, I don't think you know me as well as you think I do. I don't like scary movies." She's obviously an icon of a genre and of very scary movies and very amazing films. But her personal interests are more Louis Malle and French films and like John Hughes comedies that she kind of was up for when she was an actor, and she just happened to sort of land in that whole world of the horror genre. So that, to me, ultimately getting the sort of the human aspect, whether it's what they did, the videos they picked when they were at the rental store, to the posters and the cover art that really meant something to these folks, I think makes this film very different, because it's meant to be fun and enlightening and entertaining, as well as hopefully informational or educational.
Yeah, like I said, that's one of my favorite things about it is you get to have these people talk about movies you would otherwise not hear them talk about, and you bring in so many different people from the industry. You bring in all these directors and writers and the actors, but you also bring in other personalities. Like you have Corey Taylor's in the documentary. You have these YouTube
Yeah.
personalities like James Rolfe, who runs Cinemasker. Like you have all these other personalities in there as well, and it's so cool to see all these people come together into one documentary and just share their love of horror.
Yeah. It was a real blast, and it was real fun talking to all these folks because they came out specifically for us. We didn't catch them at a convention or in the middle of a junket. These were, prearranged sit down interviews where we had, a good hour to talk to them or more. And everyone who we sat down with really, you could tell, found it to be a refreshing talk for them because they got to talk about more than just the sort of same thing that they regurgitate. They obviously stand by their own projects and are happy to talk about them to a certain degree, but you kind of see the glaze in the eye when someone tells the same story for the umpteenth time. And so to be able to say, wow, I love The Changeling because of this, or my favorite, Heather Langenkamp talking about, even though she doesn't like scary movies, she still loves, for example, Pet Cemetery, Poltergeist. Those are some favorites of hers. These are the things where you see the glint in their eye, and I think it really comes through in this film.
Yeah, it absolutely does. And one of my favorites was Joe Dante talking about not just his werewolf movies, but other werewolf movies just in general, just seeing like how he comprehended them, and
Yeah, well, it was sort of this unexpected, unintentional wave of werewolf movies at the time. You got Larry Cohen doing a Full Moon High with as a comedy, a werewolf comedy. You've got Wolfman, you've got The Howling, you've got Company of Wolves, you've got American Werewolf in London, and it just goes on and on and on. And to have Joe Dante sort of weigh in on The Howling too,
yeah.
that to me was just a joy to be able to put in this movie.
Now, since you have so many people in this documentary, how long did it take you to work on the project from the start till now the finish?
It's been pretty much a calendar year exactly. I came on the project started a little before I came on, where it kick-started in about a year ago, in October of 2018, and then we did the Indiegogo subsequently to that. And we started shooting in the early part of the year. Over the course of several months. It was kind of a concentrated time, but then we were able to do some pickups when I was putting the film together to say, well, we can bolster this here and we can shape that there, and help get the help of the entertainment, the horror journalists to sort of create a little more context to certain selections, and that was extremely helpful. And so we've been editing it over the summer, and here we are in October, an exact calendar year later, delivering a product that ended up being twice as long as I ever intended it to be.
And a perfect time to release it too, now here in October. And then you bring up how long the documentary is. How many hours and hours of footage did you have shot for this?
Well, we did upwards of 50 interviews. Each interview lasted an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours. And on top of that, I delivered a 5-hour cut, which I still felt was still only scratching the surface because I'm a real completist. Mm-hmm. So I would keep on going if I could, but we're low budget film, crowdfunded. You got to draw the line, and you have a limited budget, and you just got to get it done. And, I think it's sort of a living, breathing entity that sort of took a life of its own. And I think potentially we could add more. I mean, there were definitely some folks that we wanted and who were interested, but we just couldn't lock them down in the time frame that we had. And I'd love to sort of chase them down for subsequent versions of this.
Yeah, and you brought up how long it is, how much hours of footage that is left out of the documentary. Is there a singular story within that footage that didn't make the final cut that you really wish you could include, maybe in a subsequent release of the movie, or
Yeah, well, it's The conversations we had a lot of conversations, and the way the film is structured is you have multiple people sort of telling a singular tale. And so even every topic that we touch upon, it's nice to have several people weighing in on that to tell a good story. And given the pacing that we have, if you sort of stop to have Larry Cohen, for example, talking about how he landed, his next It's Alive movie and Return to Salem Lot after trying to do some other films that just didn't quite get off the ground, but the deal came, in his direction. The late great Larry Cohen. We interviewed him about 3 months before he passed, unfortunately. He told some wonderful tales, but you need the time to really listen to these things, and unfortunately the format just doesn't provide for that, because the flow is inconsistent that way. If I could make a slower paced, more relaxed paced film that people would be interested in, where I could really just sort of zero in on a multitude of these interviews where you're listening to them talk for 5-10 minutes at a stretch on just one topic, there were countless stories that I think would be absolutely worthy to make a whole other film.
Yeah, and I loved hearing every one of those stories. Even if they didn't have to deal with a certain movie that was being talked about at that point, it was just always interesting to hear someone's behind the scene thoughts and Cohen's story about how there was always a rubber chicken, like he had to find it on set. I love that
Right?
story.
Isn't
Yeah,
that hysterical? And they got him.
yeah,
And he's such a good sport. He left it in the movie. I mean, he could have conceivably cut that out, right? But he also tells that tale about how in Island of the Alive, It's Alive Part 3, Island of the Alive, there's that scene where one of the babies that have now grown up to be these giant creatures attack someone in this lagoon or this pond. And they said, and action. And the guy was underwater and he just did not come up. And a minute goes by, a minute and a half, 2 minutes. And they realized this poor guy was drowning. And they basically had rescued him. And luckily everything was okay, but they caught it all on film. But nothing was, you never get to see that on film because it's not part of that movie's, narrative. Although alternatively, they said, there was a moment where Michael Moriarty is looking for the babies, and this wild boar, runs out of the jungle right at him, and everyone runs for their lives. And he's like, get it on camera, and they missed it. So those are great stories, and at least I was able to get those in there.
yeah. And one of the things I like the most is that you talk about the pacing of the film. It's almost 4.5 hours long, but you don't feel it because you break it up in such a way, because you go year by year, but in between years you take a little subsection of that 80s horror, and the subsections might include the franchises, the trope of the final girl. Was that an idea that was thought of from the beginning, or it kind of fell into place after you had all these interviews?
That was something that I definitely did from the beginning. Robin Bloch's idea was, let's do this year by year, and I wanted to expand it so it didn't feel like it was. The problem is you can't do every single movie year by year just because there are so many. So you really inevitably have to be selective. And there are always other great films that just can't make the cut for whatever reason, but not because we don't like them. But I also felt that in order to divide it up and to be able to expand on these sort of larger context discussions, we needed to go into these other chapters. So I created a narrative where we have 10 years of films, and in between each year you go into a topic or two. And I thought that would also be more rewarding for the viewer to sort of create a watchable film. And ideally, again, I did not expect it to go as long as it did, but the longer we got, the more we realized if we cut things down, kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So I'm very fortunate that when we went to our backers and we said, I delivered a cut that was 5 hours, and we're thinking of doing at least 4 hours. What do you think? And the backers, they overwhelmingly said, more. We watch 6 hours if you
Yeah.
can, but we're also limited to the format of Blu-ray and DVD and that kind of stuff like that. So when all is said and done, it's nice that I had the time that I did, and I do have, in terms of the running time, to accomplish quite a bit.
Now, now you bring up the Blu-ray and how long you have to fit it on that, but where can people find this film right now? Is it going to be available on Blu-ray coming up here shortly?
Yeah, you could go to 80shorrordoc.com and you could purchase it. And we're making it available just a limited time only in October. I believe starting October 7th, you go to 80shorrordoc.com and you can get a copy of the film, whether it's Blu-ray, DVD, digital. And then we're looking at other distribution, but we have no announcements that we can make right now. So that's the best way that people can get it. And, we're shipping it off to all the backers this month as well.
Absolutely. And I have just a couple more questions here, and one of those involves some of the special edition Blu-rays that you guys are working on, and I just saw they were released this week. There's going to be one is a Corey Taylor edition, and
Mm-hmm.
another is a Dead Meat edition.
Mm-hmm.
So could you tell us a little bit what those will include? What will make those a little bit different? Because I saw the covers, and the covers look fantastic for both of those, and I'm a big fan of both of those
Well, we're doing a third
gentlemen.
one as well, and that's the Elvira edition. And so we shot additional footage, interview footage, and a lot of the additional like we were talking about before. There's plenty of stuff that just didn't make the cut,
Hmm.
and that's just because we're covering so much ground and so fast that a lot of these people, they have a contributing moment and comment, and then we're moving on to the next. So here's an opportunity to have these guys be your guide, and to pretty much essentially host their own edition, collector's edition. And there are things that make it more fun in that there's they get their own unique enamel pin. Their posters. That amazing Graham Humphreys art is in there. They also, if they sign up this month, they get they get their name in the credits as well. And so that's kind of what makes these very special, is that they're designed to be marketed very specifically to each of individuals' fan base and their horror fan base. And so that's what we're doing as well.
Yeah, that's really cool, and I love that there's these special like fan editions that you can kind of purchase as well and kind of fit into your collection that way. And the last question I have, we're in the month of October right now. We're in Halloween season, and I'm honestly looking for a night where I can have a perfect, just Halloween movie night. So I'm trying to find some recommendations.
Yeah.
What would be a perfect Halloween movie night for you?
Halloween perfect night for me is something. What is the wedding thing? Something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue. How about that? And so I would start with a classic, black and white, probably a Universal horror film, or it would probably be Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which is one of my all-time favorites. And then I would get into the 70s, and I would probably watch something like The Omen or the Amityville Horror.
Hmm.
Those are two of my favorites. It would probably likely be Halloween as well. I mean, I'm now stacking up my own movies. I'm a huge fan of Fright Night. I'm a huge fan of Return of the Living Dead. I might sort of cap with those. And I'll throw in either Phantasm 2 or Psycho 3. Those two have always stuck with me as two absolute favorite sequels to franchises that are, extremely well known, but also arguably a little more eccentric or obscure to the average,
Yeah.
the average moviegoer. So those would be mine. What would be yours? Do you have some on the top of your head?
Off the top of my head, yeah, I kind of go a very similar direction. Night of the Living Dead is probably what I'd kick it off with, to have a black and white one to start off with. One I always like to watch around Halloween is the Blair Witch Project. It just has that fall feel, the eerie atmosphere out in the woods, and I always like to finish it off with the 1-2 of Halloween, the original John Carpenter film, and then Mike Doherty's Trick or Treat. I always like to
Oh,
finish it
an
off with those
absolute
two.
perennial classic. Absolute classic. Mike Doherty's Trick or Treat is wonderful.
Yeah.
I'm also a huge fan of Tom Savini's remake of Night on See, I'm stuck in the 80s, so Nightmare on Elm Street comes straight to mind. But it's, Night of the Living Dead, his 1990 version is really wonderful. And that's a huge favorite of mine, and that's a staple of my October viewing. But it's always tough. If I had to pick one particular night, it's going to be a marathon anyway.
Yep, exactly. So, yeah, thank you so much for being on again, David. This was so much fun to talk to you about this documentary, and I hope people go out and I hope they're not afraid of the 4-hour time frame to watch it. But it's such a breeze to sit down and a perfect time of year to watch this type of documentary.
Well, it was ultimately kind of designed. The longer it was getting, I was thinking to myself, you could watch it in sittings. You could pick it up wherever you want. You could. What's nice about the DVD and the Blu-ray is the navigation is going to allow you to go to any movie within the timeline or any chapter. So the navigation is going to be really easy to find your way through this film. So if you aren't going to tackle it in one sitting or just from beginning to end, in a chronological order, you could go, you could say, 1987, I think I'll watch a couple of the films that are that year. And it's easy to navigate to. So that's sort of the joy of being able to put this together and being able to make it digestible and accessible.
Yeah, that's a perfect way to put it. It's such a easy to digest documentary, and sometimes that's hard to find. But yeah, this movie absolutely has it and has everything you need as a horror fan or someone that's even new to the genre that's looking for recommendations too. I think this is a perfect documentary for that.
Yeah, this is a movie where after you watch it, you're going to want to watch a bunch of things. You're going to want to binge watch stuff. You're going to want to go to if not your old VHS collection, go to your DVDs, your Blu-rays, your streaming options, your Shudder channel, streaming channel, and ideally revisit your favorites and investigate new ones that you never quite knew about or have a new appreciation for.
And I got one more question I just thought
Sure.
of because I have to ask it. There's a part in the documentary where you talk about how some of these horror films from the 80s and 90s during the video rental days, how they haven't been transferred yet to DVD, Blu-ray, 4K, digital. How do you think that can change here going forward so we don't lose these movies?
Well, it's a very challenging situation. Phil Nobile Jr., who is the editor-in-chief of Fangoria magazine, he's the one who points out very appropriately that in the transfer of media, when the media is evolving, there's obviously a process where the owners need to keep up with the the media options that are becoming available. And so when VHS becomes DVD, and when DVD becomes Blu-ray, and when Blu-ray becomes 4K, and 4K becomes 6K and 7 million K, a lot of these things are going to go by the wayside. And a lot of these also, they seem to kind of fall into this sort of catch-all bin of some of these channels like Pluto TV, or some of these free options, if not Shudder. But the thing is, Netflix will not carry all of this stuff. Criterion, the Criterion streaming channel is really great, but they're not going to carry all these horror movies either. So if there's a demand for it, you got to create a movement if it's not available, because as our options expand and multiply, our availability of some of the more obscure titles, especially when they get older and older, you're not quite sure who holds the rights to these things, and a lot of times no one will touch it because they don't have the rights to it, and then it's gonna wither on the vine. So I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's important to be addressed.
Yeah, I think it was one of the most important things about this documentary that was brought up, and something that I think everybody should just stop and take a step back, from the streaming services and how much is available, and take a look at what is come before it and how we can preserve that. And I think that was an
And I
important
think
thing to
people are
bring up.
becoming savvy to this element. But I think when the streaming channels really were, especially Netflix, were really becoming gargantuan options, people had this misplaced belief that, well, it's just an expanding library, and I don't even have to keep my own physical library, because I could always, I have no more room, and I could just get it on the cloud, so to speak. But if you find going to Netflix or going to iTunes, you'll find there's hundreds and thousands of titles that you might be interested in that they just don't carry. And boy, I made the mistake of when that first happened, I started getting rid of some of my surplus, just because I'm like, well, it's on Netflix. I'll just catch it on Netflix,
Yep.
or I'll catch it on some, iTunes if I really need it, if it disappears. And they do disappear, and they cycle out, and they may never come back. And so physical media is becoming that much more valuable, especially if you're a cinephile.
Absolutely, I agree 100% on that. And David, I'd like to
And,
thank.
and video stores. I think video
Yeah,
stores need to come back.
yeah. I just worked at a place. We had video rentals still there until just last month we ended it, and it was like just a little piece of just that physical media, being able to go up to the store and grab the brand new DVD off the shelf and being able to rent that again. It's just something that's kind of missing
Well,
in the
mark
culture
mark
today.
my words. Just like vinyl made a comeback, I think video stores, to a certain degree, especially specialty ones, will make a comeback selectively, because there's going to be a nostalgia for it, and there's going to be a need for it.
Absolutely. Now, David, thank you again for being on. And where can the people find In Search of Darkness once again?
Yeah, thank you. People can go to 80shorrordoc.com to find it, and we're on all the social channels at 80shorrordoc, 80s 80s horror doc. And if you want to see my ramblings, you can find me at itcamefromblog.com, or my handle is at itcamefromblog, or just at Tiki Ambassador on Twitter. And I love interacting with everybody, and I appreciate you spreading the word about this movie, and it's much appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Since the first time I heard about it, I knew I had to see this documentary, and I'm glad I did, and I hope to share it with other people, and so they can see it and appreciate it as much as I did. So thank you once again, David, for being on.
Absolutely, and keep on keeping on with your podcast. It's wonderful. So thank you so much for having me on.
Absolutely. Thank you again. If you ever want to come back, we'll reach out and we'll figure something out in the future.
Sounds great.
All right. Thank
Take
you.
care.
Once again, thank you to David Weiner for joining us. He is the director of the In Search of Darkness documentary, and I'm so glad he took the time out of his day to come and sit and talk with me and just ramble about horror movies, because I just love doing that. And thank you all for listening. If you haven't yet, go find this documentary. Help it out. It is a great documentary. It is one of my favorites that I'm going to go back and rewatch, just like we mentioned the Nightmare on Elm Street ones and the Friday the 13th one. It's one of those that I'm going to keep going back to and watch every couple years, because it has so much information to digest under one sitting, and it's one you have to keep watching, and I love documentaries like that. So thank you all again for listening. This has been Backlot 605. You can find the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, and YouTube. Please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and be on the lookout for some very special Halloween horror-related stuff coming up very soon. We're going to be having that on the channel very soon, like I said. And yeah, thank you all again for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Backlot of South Dakota.